2,000 people in the street and not one of them is free. That is the image I need you to hold in your head before we go anywhere else. Chicago, 1993. South Side. A voter registration rally organized under the banner of an organization calling itself Growth and Development. Young black men, hundreds of them, filling the streets of Woodlawn and Inglewood. Signs, speeches, the whole production. From the outside, it looks like a community awakening. A genuine political moment. The FBI photographers working the perimeter know exactly what they are looking at. They have been watching this organization for years. Every face they photograph is a file they already have. And the man who organized every single detail of this rally, who wrote the structure, set the agenda, and gave the orders, that man is sitting in a cell inside Pontiac Correctional Center in Illinois. He has not been free since 1973. He is running a political movement, a drug empire, and a street nation of somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 members from behind a wall of cinder block and iron. His name is Larry Hoover, and the man who should have been standing beside him, the one man in America who matched his reach, his ambition, and his absolute grip on the streets of Chicago, is already gone. Buried under 60 years in federal prison on charges that have nothing to do with drugs or murder. Charges that begin with the word terrorism. His name is Jeff Fort, and together these two men did not just run gangs. They split the entire city of Chicago into two nations, and the fault line they drew is still bleeding today. I want you to go back, way back, before the indictments and the supermax sales and the documentaries. Before any of this made sense. You have to understand what Chicago's South Side was in the early 1960s to understand how any of this was even possible. The Great Migration had been moving black families out of the Jim Crow South and into northern cities for decades. By the time the 1960s arrived, Chicago's South Side was one of the most densely populated black communities in the entire United States. Neighborhoods like Woodlawn, Inglewood, and Grand Boulevard were packed. Families stacked into buildings that the city refused to maintain, into public housing projects that were designed, literally by policy, to concentrate poverty in specific zip codes and keep it contained. The Robert Taylor Homes opened in 1962 and stretched for nearly 2 miles along State Street. 28 high-rise buildings, approximately 27,000 residents at its peak, the overwhelming majority of them black, the overwhelming majority of them poor. And the city built it that way on purpose. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is documented urban planning policy. Into that world, two boys are coming up at roughly the same time on the same side of the same city, and they could not be more different in their approach to the same impossible situation. Jeff Ford is born in 1947 in Aberdeen, Mississippi. His family migrates north and lands in Chicago's Woodlawn neighborhood on the south side. He is small, he is sharp, and by the time he is a teenager in the early 1960s, he is already running with a crew called the Blackstone Rangers. The Rangers had been founded around 1959 and 1960 in the Woodlawn neighborhood, and Ford does not just join them, he takes them over. He reorganizes them, he expands them. By the mid-1960s, the Rangers are one of the largest and most organized street gangs in the city, and Fort, still a teenager, is their undisputed leader. But here's the part that most people skip over. I want you to pay attention because this detail explains everything that comes later. In 1967, the Reverend John Fry of the First Presbyterian Church in Woodlawn becomes an unlikely ally to Jeff Fort. Fry opens the church as a meeting place for the Rangers. He genuinely believes, that Fort and his organization can be redirected into a community force. And for a moment, it almost looks like he is right. The thing I keep coming back to is what happened next, because it is so absurd that if you wrote it in a movie, nobody would believe it. In 1967 and 1968, the Blackstone Rangers, a street gang, received a federal grant of nearly $1 million through the Office of Economic Opportunity, a Great Society program under President Lyndon Johnson. The idea was job training, community development, turn the Rangers into a workforce program for the young men of Woodlawn. Let me paint the picture for you. The United States federal government wrote a check to a street gang, a check that in today's dollars would be worth roughly $8 to $9 million, and the man signing the receipts was Jeff Fort. The program produced almost no verifiable job placements. The Senate investigation that followed, led by Senator John McClellan, found that a significant portion of the money was unaccounted for. Fort was called before the Senate. He sat there in his dashiki and his black beret and refused to answer questions. I'll be honest. Watching that archival footage, I do not know whether to be horrified or impressed. The audacity of that man sitting in the United States Senate, looking at senators dead in the eye and saying nothing, that is not fear. That is a different kind of power entirely. Now, while Ford is navigating federal grant money in Senate hearings on the South Side, something else is being built a few miles away. The Disciples, or more specifically, the Black Disciples, later to become the Gangster Disciples, under a man named David Barksdale. Barksdale is born in Salis, Mississippi in 1947, the same year as Ford, and he migrates to Chicago's South Side as well. He rises through a gang called the Devil's Disciples, and by the mid-1960s, he has merged several South Side crews into an organization he calls the Black Disciples Nation. Barksdale is, by every account from people who were there, one of the most naturally gifted street leaders Chicago ever produced. Charismatic, intelligent, politically aware in ways that his era rarely rewarded. And coming up under Barksdale is a young man from the Cabrini area, later relocated to Inglewood on the South Side, a young man named Larry Hoover. Hoover is born in 1950 in Jackson, Mississippi. His family comes north as part of the same migration that brought the Forts and the Barksdales to Chicago. He comes up fast inside the disciple structure. He is not the loudest man in the room, but he is always the most organized. By the early 1970s, with Barksdale's health declining, Barksdale was suffering from kidney disease after being shot in 1969. That wound would eventually take his life in 1974. Hoover is already positioned to inherit the entire Disciples organization, but before any of that happens, 1973 arrives. And 1973 changes everything. November 1973, Larry Hoover, 23 years old, is convicted of murder in the killing of William Young, a 19-year-old Inglewood man who was suspected of stealing from the Disciples. The details in the court record are specific. Young was lured, beaten, and shot. Hoover was convicted as the organizer of the murder. He is sentenced to 100 to 200 years in Illinois State Prison. 100 to 200 years. The judge at sentencing made his position clear. This was not a sentence designed to release Larry Hoover. This was a sentence designed to end him. But the streets had other plans, and what the judge did not know yet was that sending Larry Hoover to prison was not the end of the Disciples. It was the beginning of something the Illinois Department of Corrections had never seen before. Inside Stateville Correctional Center and later at Pontiac, Hoover does not shrink. He does not lose his grip. He does the thing that every great street leader who ends up inside eventually figures out. He builds infrastructure that does not require his physical presence. He creates ranks, written literature, a code of laws for the disciples that gets codified into something they call the Book of Knowledge. He issues directives. He holds court inside the prison. His lieutenants on the outside execute his orders, and they do it because the organization he built is not built on fear alone. It is built on loyalty, on identity, on the feeling that belonging to the gangster disciples under Larry Hoover means something. Do the math on what he is managing. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the gangster disciples are operating across virtually every black neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. The organization has members inside every significant Illinois correctional facility, and Hoover is coordinating all of it from behind bars. Meanwhile, Jeff Fort is on a trajectory that is moving in a completely different direction. And this is the part of the story where the two nations really begin to take shape. By the early 1970s, Fort had renamed the Blackstone Rangers the Black Pea Stone Nation. The P stood for peace, though the irony of that name will reveal itself shortly. The Black Pea Stones under Fort are aligned with a loose coalition of Southside gangs organized under what will eventually become known as the People Nation. The disciples and their allies, including the Black Gangster disciples, will align under the Folks Nation. Now, I need you to understand what the People and Folks alignment actually was, because this is one of the most misunderstood chapters in Chicago gang history. It was not a peace treaty. Let me say that again. The People and Folks alignment was not a peace treaty. It was a reorganization. A sorting of gangs into two super alliances that established rules of engagement, who you could fight, who was your ally by default, what symbols you wore, and how you wore them. The 5-pointed star for people, the 6-pointed star for folks, left versus right, the pitchfork pointing up or pointing down. An entire symbolic language built into how a man wore his hat, how he folded his bandana, which pocket he put his hands in. The theoretical architect of this alignment, according to most accounts from that era, was a man named Jerome Freeman, known as Shorty Freeman, working in coordination with leadership from both the People and Folks sides. But make no mistake, the two men whose organizations gave the alignment its actual weight and authority were Fort and Hoover. They were the biggest names on each side, and the city of Chicago was the board they were playing on. 6 blocks. That's it. In some parts of the South Side, the line between People territory and Folks territory was 6 city blocks. You grew up on one side of that line, and the color of everything around you meant something different than it did 6 blocks over. The hat went a different direction. The handshake had different steps. The flag was different. And dying on the wrong side of that line for the wrong reason was so common it stopped making the front page. But here's the thing about that kind of power on the streets. It does not stay theoretical for long. And Jeff Fort was about to make a move that would take this story somewhere none of us expected. By the late 1970s, Fort had converted to Islam and renamed the Black Pea Stone Nation the El Rukns. The transformation was genuine in its religious dimension, and Fort embraced the Moorish science tradition and later a version of Islam that had connections to Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi's international outreach programs. And that last sentence is where this story leaves the streets of Chicago and enters the territory of international terrorism. I've been telling these stories for years, and this next part still messes me up every single time. In 1986, the federal government charged Jeff Fort and several El Rukn leaders with a plot to commit terrorist acts on behalf of Libya in exchange for $2.5 million. The specific charges included a plan to shoot down a government airplane using a military-grade anti-tank weapon, a weapon the El Rukns had actually obtained. The government's evidence included recorded conversations between Fort and Libyan officials. The weapon existed. The conversations existed. The deal existed. Fort was convicted in 1987 and sentenced to 75 years in federal prison. On top of a 13-year state sentence he was already serving. He was transferred to the Federal Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, ADX Florence, the supermax that houses the most dangerous federal prisoners in the United States. Neighbors at ADX Florence have included the Unabomber, the 1993 World Trade Center bombers, and later the Boston Marathon bomber. That is the company Jeff Fort keeps now. And what Jeff Fort did not know yet was that his removal from the board would not weaken the El Rukns as quickly as the government hoped. The organization had lieutenants, safe houses, communication systems, and enough money in motion to keep running for years. The federal government would eventually bring the entire El Rucan leadership structure down, but it took until the early 1990s to complete that work. Multiple trials, dozens of convictions, a prosecutor named William Hogan who spent years methodically dismantling what Fort built. The El Rucans' drug operation, according to federal prosecutors at the time, was generating reported revenues in the millions annually, though exact figures were disputed across different proceedings. What is not disputed is the scale. The El Rucans controlled significant portions of the Southside narcotics trade for years, and they did it under a religious organizational structure that made infiltration unusually difficult. But back on the folk side of that line, Larry Hoover is not watching Fort's collapse and taking comfort in it. He is watching it and taking notes, because Hoover understands something fundamental about the moment he is living through. The 1980s crack era has changed the economics of street organizations in a way that is difficult to overstate. Before crack, the money on the South Side was real but manageable. The networks were neighborhood scale. After crack, the money became something different. According to federal estimates cited in subsequent RICO proceedings, the gangster disciples under Hoover's direction were generating somewhere in the range of $100 million a year in drug revenues by the early 1990s. I want you to sit with that number for a second. $100 million a year from street-level drug distribution. That is not a gang, that is a corporation, and Hoover is running it from a prison cell. Here's how the operation worked at its functional peak. Hoover's directives moved through a network of lieutenants called governors, regional commanders who each controlled specific geographic areas of Chicago's South Side, and by the late 1980s, sections of cities across the Midwest where gangster disciples members had relocated and established new operations. Each governor ran a set of coordinators beneath him. Beneath the coordinators were the street-level soldiers. Money moved up the chain, orders moved down. It was a franchise model applied to narcotics distribution, and it worked with a consistency that the FBI spent years trying to diagram. The Chicago Tribune, reporting on the investigation, described the gangster disciples as operating with a structure that resembled a Fortune 500 company more than a street gang. That comparison is not flattery. It is a description of the specific problem facing law enforcement in the late 1980s and early 1990s. How do you prosecute a man who never touches the product, who never physically hands over money, whose name is sometimes not even spoken in the conversations you are recording because everyone already knows who they are talking about? The answer eventually is RICO, the Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act, the same legal instrument that brought down the 5 families of the New York Mafia in the 1980s. And what Hoover did not know yet was that the same federal prosecutors who had watched the Mafia cases succeed were already studying his organization with exactly that framework in mind. But before the indictment comes, Hoover makes a move that is either the most brilliant piece of organizational maneuvering in Chicago gang history or the most catastrophic miscalculation, depending on which side of the bars you are standing on. In the early 1990s, Hoover rebrands. The gangster disciples become, at least officially, growth and development. The language shifts from gang terminology to political and community organizing language. There are voter registration drives. There are anti-violence summits. There are meetings with elected officials, some of whom later claimed they had no idea who they were sitting across from. A political action committee called 21st Century Vote is established. The organization begins producing a newsletter called Don't Sell Out. Now, and I want to be careful here because this is genuinely complicated, some of what growth and development did in those years was real. Voter registration happened. Young men who had never engaged in any civic process were being encouraged to participate in one. The FBI, in its surveillance documents, acknowledged the community programs were genuine in their execution, even as they documented that the drug distribution network was running simultaneously underneath all of it. I'll be honest, the thing that gets me about this period is the question of what might have been possible if the infrastructure Hoover built had ever been fully redirected. 30 to 50,000 people organized enough to receive instructions, follow a chain of command, and show up somewhere when told to. That is a political force. In the right hands, used the right way, that is transformation. But the money it ran on was crack cocaine, and those two things cannot coexist. The one always corrupts the other, and that is exactly what the federal government was documenting, frame by frame. Operation Headache. That is the name the FBI gave to the investigation targeting Larry Hoover and the gangster disciples. And the name alone tells you something about how the government felt about what it was up against. This was not just a drug case. It was a takedown designed to sever the head of the largest street gang in American history. The investigation ran for years and involved hundreds of hours of recorded conversations, cooperating witnesses from inside the gangster disciple structure, men who had been arrested and made a calculation about their own futures, and surveillance of the financial networks that moved money from South Side street corners into a pool that eventually reached Hoover's direction. By 1995, the federal indictment came down. Hoover and 38 co-defendants were charged under RICO statutes with running a continuing criminal enterprise, the drug distribution operation, while simultaneously using the growth and development front to maintain the organization's discipline and loyalty. The government's position was that the political programs were not a genuine transition. They were a management tool for keeping the drug network intact. Hoover went to trial in federal court in 1997, and this is where his own words became some of the most damaging evidence against him. Recorded conversations captured Hoover discussing the drug trade in terms that left prosecutors very little interpretive work to do. The language was not always direct. Experienced street leaders learned quickly that direct language on a recorded line is a gift to prosecutors, but the context was unambiguous enough that the jury needed only a short deliberation. In August 1997, Larry Hoover was convicted on charges of running a continuing criminal enterprise through the Gangster Disciples organization. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms in federal prison, added on top of the 100 to 200 year state sentence he had been serving since 1973. 6 life terms. He was transferred to ADX Florence, the same federal supermax in Colorado where Jeff Fort was already housed. 2 men, same city, same generation, same South Side soil, different alliances, different organizations, different philosophies. Both now buried under concrete and still in Florence, Colorado. Both serving sentences that make release mathematically impossible without an act of executive clemency. And here's the irony that I go back to every time I think about this story. For all the talk of the war between people and folks, between the El Rukns and the gangster disciples, between Fort and Hoover, the two of them ended up in the same building. A DX Florence does not have gang affiliations. It does not have neighborhoods. It does not have sides. It has ranges and tiers and 23 hours of daily solitary confinement. The war that split Chicago into 2 nations ended with both generals in the same federal tomb. The streets they left behind did not stop fighting just because they were gone. That is the part that does not get said clearly enough. After Hoover's 1997 federal conviction, the Gangster Disciples did not dissolve. The franchise model he built was too embedded, too distributed, too self-sustaining to collapse from one prosecution, even of the top leadership. Federal law enforcement continued to bring RICO cases against GD leadership in Chicago and in cities across the Midwest and Southeast well into the 2000s and the 2010s. The organization that Hoover built from a Stateville prison cell in the 1970s was still generating federal indictments in cities like Milwaukee, Indianapolis, and Memphis 3 decades after his incarceration. The El Rukns, by contrast, were more thoroughly dismantled. The combination of Fort's terrorism conviction, the subsequent trials that took down his top lieutenants, and the seizure of their headquarters, a South Side building they called the Fort at 3947 South Drexel Boulevard, essentially ended the organization as a coherent street force, by the mid-1990s. Members scattered into other organizations. Some joined other People Nation gangs. The name El Rukns faded, but the Black P. Stone Nation name survived. There are people on the South Side today who still carry that affiliation. I went down the rabbit hole on this one, specifically on the question of what legacy either of these men actually left behind. And the answer is uncomfortable from every direction you approach it. Larry Hoover's legal team has maintained for years that he is a changed man, that the growth and development programs represented a genuine evolution, and that 6 consecutive life terms is a sentence without any proportional logic given his physical removal from street operations for decades. His supporters, and there are real ones, including some hip-hop artists who have publicly advocated for his release, argue that the communities most harmed by his organization's drug trade would be better served by his advocacy from the outside than by his continued confinement. Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich considered a clemency petition from Hoover in 2002. He declined. The federal sentence makes state clemency irrelevant to his federal custody regardless. Jeff Fort has no public advocacy campaign, no music industry support. The terrorism conviction put him in a category that makes political advocacy nearly impossible. He is 77 years old at the time of this script. He has been incarcerated since 1983 on the state charge and under the federal terrorism sentence. Release is not a conversation anyone in Washington is having. 2 nations, 1 city, 2 men who between them shaped the geography, the language, the economics, and the violence of Chicago's South Side for 3 generations. The people and folks alignment they anchored is still the organizational framework that most Chicago street gangs operate within today. The 6-pointed star and the 5-pointed star are still on the walls. The symbolic language they build into everyday life, which direction you turn your hat, which side you stand on, is still being taught to teenagers in neighborhoods that Hoover and Ford have not seen since before those teenagers were born. That is what it means to build something that outlasts your freedom. Back to that 1993 rally. 2,000 people in a Chicago street, voter registration forms in their hands, organized by a man in a prison cell who has not been free in 20 years. The FBI photographers are working the perimeter. They are building a case. They already know what growth and development really is underneath the language. And Larry Hoover, somewhere in Pontiac, is probably also aware that they know. He keeps running it anyway. That image, 2,000 people organized by a man who cannot be there, is the entire story of what happened when the South Side produced 2 leaders capable of building nations. The tragedy is not that they fell. The tragedy is what they built those nations on. And the fault line they drew through the middle of Chicago is still there, still live, still bleeding on streets that neither of them will ever walk again. Click here to check out another video. Click here to subscribe.